all that Jesus meant by this, but they understood enough to see that what he said implied a big claim about his own person. He, Jesus, was from above, whereas they were from below. They were of this world, whereas he was not of this world. Chapter 8, verse 23. Unless they believed that I am he. And remember that I am he in the Hebrew is Yahweh, the same word that the Lord spoke when he identified himself as Yahweh to Moses. Unless they now believe that Jesus is Yahweh, or in the Greek ego eimi, unless they believed that he was the Messiah, they would die in their sins. Verse 24. This certainly meant that Jesus was claiming to be on a very different level from the one where they stood. So, quite naturally, they asked Jesus, "Who are you?" Verse 25. In the Greek, the pronoun you is placed at the front of the sentence. By doing this, the emphasis is on the word you. Hence, the force of their question was just who do you think you are? Or, who are you to make such big claims about yourself? In John 8, verse 25 to 27, Jesus replied, "Even what I told you from the beginning. I have much to say about you and much to judge. But he who sent me is true, and I declare to the world what I have heard from him." They did not understand that he spoke to them of the Father. If the people are to believe in Jesus, they must know who he is. In reply, Jesus told them that he could only say what he's been saying all along. They must hold themselves to the word which he had already spoken to them. He is what his words have clearly indicated. Jesus evidently means that there is no point in explaining further what he has said. His hearers have such closed minds that they will not understand. To be sure, even though he has no more to say about himself, he has a great deal to say about them, and those other things concern judgment. So he said, "I have much to say about you, and much to judge." If Jesus were to say all he knows, it would be a judgment for them. His silence is grace, which holds back those words which, if expressed, would bring shame and condemnation for them. When Jesus keeps silent, as well as when he speaks, he first looks to the Father, who teaches him what to speak, when to speak, and when to keep silent.
Dr. Theophilus, the mic is you.
John 8, verse 26. "But he, the Father, who sent me, is true, and I declare to the world what I have heard from him." Jesus claims to be the emissary of his Father, and he gives no other teaching than that which he has heard from his Father. When Jesus does speak, every word is true, for it has come from the Father, and the Father is true. Furthermore, the Father who sent him is now with him, so that he is never alone, and no action or word of his is ever derived apart from his fellowship with the Father. Jesus' words are God's words. In the person of Jesus, all that is pleasing to God stands visibly in the midst of the Jews, and for this reason his teaching is directed beyond the Jews standing before him to all the Jews in the world, yes, and to the whole world itself. John 8:27. They did not understand that he spoke to them of the Father. The Jews present did not recognize that he was speaking of his relation to God, but supposed him to be speaking of a relationship to someone who did not happen to be present. That a human being could have such a deep personal fellowship with God that he is clearly guided by what he hears and discerns to be from God, such close fellowship with God seemed impossible to them. That Jesus says nothing unless he has first heard it from his Father, this for them was unheard of. John 8, verse 28. So Jesus said, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am he, and that I do nothing on my own authority, but speak thus as the Father taught me. Jesus said the time will come when they will realize that He is in fact the One, the Messiah. It is not a dream or an empty claim. Instead, it is very real and exactly as He said. His perfect fellowship with the Father will become evident to them when they have lifted Him up. The term lifted Him up refers, of course, to the crucifixion, though they may not have understood it at that time. The term lifted up is also used later of Christ's exaltation, His ascension into heaven. He was lifted up to the throne of God. Jesus had said, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am He." This was a promise for those who were believers, but it was terrifying for those who were His opponents. Jesus expressed the certainty that He will not remain the unknown one, but rather that the Father will illumine and glorify Him before His opponents. But this revelation will not happen before the crucifixion. Instead, it will happen through the crucifixion. Before His crucifixion, their eyes were not opened until they had hung Him on the cross. But by the cross, when He was rejected by them and hung on a cross, by this they will penetrate the mystery of His person and recognize Him for who He is. As Jesus later told His disciples, "I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself." John 12:32. Then follows verse 29, "And He who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do what is pleasing to Him." Jesus knows the bitter cross that lies before Him. Nonetheless, He goes forward boldly because He knows that this is His Father's will. When He goes to the cross, the Father will be with Him. As He hangs upon the cross, it will appear that the Father has abandoned Him, but this is not the case. God will not abandon Him because He, on His part, has not abandoned the Father, but instead has always done that which is pleasing to Him. When Jesus says He always does what is pleasing to Him, this says that His life is spent entirely in doing things which please His Father. Christians often speak of the sinlessness of Jesus, which of course is true. But that is a negative statement. It tells us what He did not do. But here we have the positive statement. Not only does He avoid evil and sin, but He actively does the good. Let's see. He always does the things that please His Father. As Jesus spoke to the crowds in the temple, He spoke with great confidence, even though He spoke alone and had none of the authorities on His side, and even though He was continuously threatened and opposed by them. Furthermore, Jesus based His entire confidence not on Himself, nor on any human resource, but on God, whom He knew was with Him as a living presence. Added to this the shining perfection of His pure will, which was surrendered in complete obedience to the will of His Father. All this made a deep impression on some of His hearers, even though they did not fully understand Him. So they believed in Him. They at least believed that He was genuine and right, even though they did not fully understand Him. Jesus then said to the Jews who had believed in Him, "If you continue in my word, you are truly my disciples." Verse 32, "And you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free." Jesus says that those who now believed were beginners in faith, that the faith which Jesus' words had awakened in their hearts was only a beginning. It lacked understanding and depth. It was Jesus' word which had awakened a flicker of faith in their hearts, but now their faith must grow and develop depth. A disciple, when he is fully taught, will be like his teacher, as Luke said in chapter 6, verse 40. Would these disciples then continue in His word? Would they allow it to shape their thoughts, take control of their wills, and engender love in their hearts. If they continue in His Word and allow it to have its way in their hearts, then He who is the light of the world will further enlighten them. His truth would supplant the worthless thoughts, empty opinions, hurtful delusions, and lies by which they had previously been guided in the past. In time, under the tutelage of His Word, they would know the truth, God's truth, and it would free them from chains that had held them captive to false ways of thinking and living,